It was just a christening photo from 1888. But zoom in on the shawl and something is wrong. At first glance, it is exactly what the label says it is. A round-faced infant in a christening gown, propped against a bolster on a horsehair settee. The family arranged around him with the stiff formality every Victorian portrait demands. You have seen 100 photographs like it, but look closer, at the shawl draped over what appears to be the arm of the settee, just behind the child's shoulder. And for 136 years, nobody did. Not the family who kept it in a cedar box. Not the archivists who cataloged it in 1974. Not the graduate students who scanned it for a digitization project in 2009. It took a conservator with a raking light and 40 minutes. She almost didn't have to notice that the folds of that shawl are not the folds the cloth makes when it hangs. They are the folds of cloth made when it is wrapped around a hand. This is a story about a photograph that was built, deliberately, to make a person disappear, and about what it means, dignity, memory, and truth, when we finally learn how to see the thing that was hidden in front of us the whole time. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe that old photographs are not just images but evidence, and that the people erased from them deserve to be found, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps this kind of research keep reaching people. Dr. Renata Kessler has spent 19 years as a photograph conservator, the last 11 of them at the Maine Historical Society in Portland. And she will tell you that most donations arrive the same way, apologetically. A grandchild finds a box in an attic, doesn't know what to do with it, and brings it in, half expecting to be told it's worthless. That was more or less the mood on a wet Tuesday in October 2022, when a retired schoolteacher named Arthur Pelletier carried a cardboard carton up the front steps of the Society's brick building on Congress Street, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. Inside the carton, wrapped in a moth-eaten wool blanket, was a cedar cigar box that had belonged to his great-aunt, and inside that box were photographs. Tintypes, cabinet cards, a few brittle glass negatives, going back, as far as anyone could then tell, to the years just after the Civil War. One photograph stood out immediately, not because it was strange, but because it was beautiful. A cabinet card, album in print on cardstock, the corners gone soft and rounded with handling. On the back, in faded copperplate ink, someone had written a date, June 1888, and a single word that had been half scraped away with a fingernail or a blade, leaving only 3 legible letters, DES. No names, no studio stamp, which was unusual for the period when most photographers pressed their imprint into the lower corner of every card they sold. Kessler noted the absence in her intake log as a provenance gap, archivist language for a hole in the paper trail that someone, deliberately or not, had left behind. The composition itself was conventional, almost to the point of anonymity. A christening portrait, an infant, perhaps 4 or 5 months old, in a long white gown that pooled around him like a wave frozen mid-break, propped against a tufted bolster on a horsehair settee. Behind and around him, 4 adults in dark, high-collared, mourning-adjacent Sunday clothes, the kind of clothes New England families wore whether they were mourning or not, because color photography did not exist and severity photographed as respectability. A painted backdrop showed a garden balustrade and a suggestion of trees, the standard studio scenery of the decade. Every face wore the fixed, unsmiling expression required by exposure, times that could run 4 to 8 seconds, long enough that a smile would blur into something worse than solemnity. Kessler dated the card confidently to the late 1880s from the cabinet format, the beveled card edges gilded in gold, and the gown's leg of mutton sleeve, a style that entered fashion around 1887 and would balloon absurdly by the mid-1890s. Everything about the photograph said, ordinary family, ordinary Tuesday at the studio. Nothing here worth a second look. Kessler almost filed it that way. But cataloging procedure at the Society requires a raking light examination for anything selected for digitization. Tilting a low, near horizontal light, source across the surface of a print to reveal texture invisible under normal illumination, the same principle a forger's detector uses to catch a repaired canvas. She switched off the overhead lamp, angled her desk light until it nearly grazed the print's surface, and began moving it slowly across the image, the way she had 10,000 times before. Cloth, gown, bolster, settee. And then, at the lower right third of the frame, she stopped. The shawl draped over what she had assumed was the settee's rolled arm did not sit the way fabric sits over furniture. Furniture holds a shawl in long, gravity-pulled folds, the cloth breaking wherever it meets an edge. This shawl is bunched. It gathered into 5 distinct ridges, evenly spaced, each with a rounded terminus. And beneath the topmost ridge, the fabric puckered inward at a point that had no business puckering at all, unless something underneath it was gripping the cloth from inside. She sat with the print for a long time before she said anything to anyone. Then she picked up the phone. She called Dr. Felix Anandan, a conservation scientist she had collaborated with twice before, based at the Image Permanence Research Lab, affiliated with the Rochester Institute of Technology, home to one of the country's most respected photographic technology imaging programs. Anandan had spent years developing protocols for multispectral imaging on 19th century photographic materials, a technique that captures a surface under multiple wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet through the visible spectrum into near-infrared, because different pigments, papers, and retouching materials reflect and absorb those wavelengths differently, revealing alterations invisible to the naked eye. He agreed to look at high-resolution scans within the week. What the scans showed, when they came back that November, ended any question of coincidence. Under raking light, photographed at 1,200 dots per inch, the fold pattern in the shawl resolved into something unmistakable. 4 finger-shaped ridges and a 5th, shorter, thumb-shaped ridge, gripping a twist of fabric with enough pressure to leave a compression mark that had survived, faintly, in the print's tonal range for over a century. Under near-infrared, which can penetrate certain surface coatings and reveal underlying density variations in the original paper, negatives exposure, a soft, darkened mass became visible beneath the shawl's lower edge, roughly the size and shape of a forearm. And under ultraviolet fluorescence, which makes retouching varnish glow differently than the surrounding print, because photographers of the era commonly use gum arabic or albumin-based retouching mediums to smooth over unwanted details. A faint, uneven sheen appeared across almost the entire shawl and the settee arm beneath it, a sheen that did not appear anywhere else on the card. Someone, in 1888, had gone over that portion of the image by hand after it was printed, softening its edges. Anandan did not say much on the phone call where he walked Kessler through the results. There was a long pause after he finished describing the ultraviolet findings. "Somebody's under that shawl," he finally said, "and somebody else made sure you wouldn't notice." Anandan explained what he believed the shawl was hiding, and the explanation reached back into the actual mechanics of Victorian photography. In the 1880s, portrait photography still required long exposures, often 4 to 8 seconds even in a well-lit studio, sometimes longer indoors on an overcast day because photographic emulsions of the period were far less light-sensitive than modern film. An adult could hold nearly motionless for that long if instructed. An infant could not. So, photographers and mothers developed a practical solution that photographic historians have documented extensively over the past 3 decades. The mother, nurse, or another adult would hold the baby steady through the entire exposure while disguised, usually beneath a blanket, drape, or piece of furniture upholstery, matched to the studio's backdrop so that the finished print appeared to show the child sitting or lying unsupported. Sometimes the disguise was crude, an obvious lump under a curtain, an extra pair of hands emerging from behind a chair. Sometimes, with a skilled retoucher, it was nearly seamless. This practice has a name among collectors and photo historians today: hidden mother photography. It was common enough across the United States, Britain, and parts of Europe between roughly 1870 and 1900 that thousands of surviving examples exist in museums and private collections. What made the Pelletier cabinet card unusual was not that a mother was hidden in it. It was how thoroughly someone had tried to erase the fact that she had been hidden at all, retouching not just the drape's edges, but, as later research would reveal, the identity of the woman herself. That distinction sent Kessler back to the box, and to Arthur Pelletier's memory for anything that might attach a name to the christened infant. Pelletier recalled his great-aunt mentioning once a family connection to the Cabots up in Bangor. Not the famous Boston Cabots, he was careful to clarify, but a lumber money branch that had made a fortune in Maine's timber trade after the Civil War and liked, in the way of newly wealthy families everywhere, to borrow the cadence of an old name. That was enough of a thread to follow into the Maine State Archives in Augusta, where Kessler began the kind of methodical search that constitutes most of an archivist's actual work. Hours that produce nothing, followed by 10 minutes that produce everything. The first useful document arrived from the Bangor Public Library's genealogy room, in a bound volume of First Baptist Church of Bangor's baptismal registry, dated June 17, 1888. A Sunday, 3 days after the ink notation on the back of the cabinet card, was an entry for the christening of one Winslow Ambrose Cabot, infant son of Horace and Millicent Cabot of Broadway Street, Bangor. The registry recorded no godparents, unusual for a family of that social standing, and no attending relatives beyond the immediate household. Kessler noted the gap and moved on, because a hit like this always opens a second door before the first one closes. The 1880 federal census, when she pulled it, placed the Cabot household at the same Broadway Street address 8 years before the christening. Horace Cabot, 34, lumber merchant. Millicent Cabot, 29, keeping house. 2 older children, and a 4th resident listed simply as servant. A 26-year-old woman named Odessa Freeman. Occupation given as domestic. Birthplace recorded as Virginia. Kessler reached instinctively for the 1890 federal census next, the record that should have shown the household at the exact moment of the christening, and hit the wall that every American genealogist eventually hits. The 1890 census was almost entirely destroyed in a 1921 fire at the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C., and what survived the flames was later discarded during a records disposal in the 1930s. Fewer than 1% of the original schedules exist today. For the single year that mattered most, the paper trail simply did not exist. It was, Kessler would say later, like watching a door close in your face at the exact moment you reached for the handle. She turned instead to Friedman's Bureau records, held at the National Archives in Washington, and increasingly digitized through a partnership with the Smithsonian's Transcription Initiative. Records created by the federal agency established in 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people with labor contracts, family reunification, and, often, the first written documentation of their legal names. There, in a labor contract register from Petersburg, Virginia, dated 1867, Kessler found an Odessa Freeman, age 5, listed alongside her mother, Ruth Freeman, both formerly held in bondage on a plantation outside Petersburg, both now negotiating, through the Bureau's office, a paid domestic labor contract with a northern textile family relocating to Massachusetts. The contract traced Odessa's path north over the following decade, Massachusetts, then Maine, by the mid-1870s, moving, as many black domestic workers of the period did, between employers who valued the same skills, laundry, child care, and, increasingly as she aged into her 20s, the highly specific and physically demanding labor of wet nursing, feeding and settling infants for white employers who could afford the arrangement. That last detail reframed everything Kessler thought she understood about the photograph. Odessa Freeman was not merely a servant who happened to be present at a christening. Given her documented occupation and the household's youngest child's age in 1888, she was very likely Winslow Cabot's wet nurse and primary caregiver, the person whose arms he would have known better than his own mother's in the first months of his life. And she was very likely the person hidden beneath that shawl, steadying him through an 8-second exposure, while a retoucher was later paid to make sure that no trace of her remained visible except the accidental grip of a hand no one thought to check for. It was around this point in the research that Kessler brought in a documentary historian at the University of Maine specializing in 19th century domestic labor, Dr. Solveig Marchetti, who had spent years studying the particular erasure of black domestic and child care workers from Gilded Age family archives in New England. Marchetti's explanation was blunt. Northern households in the post-war decades, she said, often depended enormously on black women's labor, nursing infants, running households, raising children who would grow up to inherit fortunes their caregivers never shared in. while simultaneously working to keep those women out of the family's visual and written record. A wet nurse might live in a household for a decade and appear in no photograph, no letter, no family Bible entry. Because her presence complicated a story the family preferred to tell about itself, one of self-sufficient respectability, untouched by the messier facts of who had actually done the physical work of raising its children. They needed her hands, Marchetti said, and they needed her invisible. The shawl isn't clumsy staging, it's the whole relationship, photographed. The document trail deepened from there. A probate inventory filed after Horace Cabot's death in 1901, held in the Penobscot County Probate Court records, listed household staff wages paid through that year, including, in a ledger entry easy to miss among columns of lumber accounts, 17 years of wages to O. Freeman, domestic, ending abruptly in 1902, with no forwarding notation, no severance, no further trace in Bangor City directories after that date. A woman who had raised at least one Cabot child from infancy through wet nursing and continued in the household's employ for nearly 2 decades simply stopped appearing in any record Kessler could locate in Maine. She had not died there. No death certificate, no cemetery record, no obituary in the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier. She had, as far as the paper trail could show, walked out of the historical record entirely, the same way she had been made to walk out of the photograph. It was a letter, finally, that gave Odessa Freeman back her voice, not found among the Cabot family's papers, where nothing of hers survived, but among a small collection of manumission-era correspondence donated decades earlier to the Maine Historical Society by an unrelated Bangor family who had employed Freeman briefly between Cabot positions in the early 1890s, and who had unusually kept a note she'd written them requesting a reference. It was dated March 1893, addressed to a Mrs. Whitcomb, and Kessler found it only because she searched the finding aid for the surname a second time, on a hunch, after everything else had gone cold. The letter reads, in Freeman's own hand and spelling, exactly as she wrote it. Dear Mrs. Whitcomb, I hope this finds you and the children in good health. I am writing to ask if you would be so kind as to put down some words about my service to you, as I am seeking a new place and Mr. and Mrs. Cabot will not give me one, though I nursed their boy from his first week and loved him as my own. I will say it plain. I have not seen him since I left that house, and I think of him most days, wondering if he walks yet, does he favor his mother, or does he favor me, in some small way that nobody will say out loud. I have raised 4 children that were not mine to keep and given up every one of them when the giving up was asked of me. It is hard work, harder than the wash and the cooking, though nobody counts it that way. I would take good work in your house if you have it. I am strong, and I do not tire easily, whatever else people believe of a woman my age. Yours respectfully, Odessa Freeman. There is no record of whether Mrs. Whitcomb wrote the reference. There is no record of where Odessa Freeman went after 1893, but there is now a photograph, the only one anyone has found, that puts her hands, if not her face, in the same frame as one of the children she raised and was never permitted to be seen with. For over a century, the fold of a shawl held that fact in silence. It took a raking light, a multispectral scanner, and a conservator willing to look twice at something that seemed finished. The larger truth the shawl unlocks is not really about one household in Bangor, Maine, or one hidden hand in one photograph. It is about how thoroughly the domestic labor of black women in the decades after emancipation was built into the physical survival of white families, feeding their children, literally, with their own bodies in the case of wet nursing, while being systematically excluded from those same families' visual and written memory. Historians studying the post-war North have documented this pattern again and again. Households whose comfort depended entirely on labor that their family portraits, letters, and legal records were quietly engineered to omit. A photograph like the Cabot christening card is not an aberration. It is a rare surviving instance of a much larger, much older act of erasure finally becoming visible, because in this one case, the person doing the erasing left just enough of a trace, 4 fingers and a thumb pressed into cloth, for someone else to find, a century and a third later. Marchetti and Kessler spent the better part of 2023 trying to locate Odessa Freeman's descendants, working outward from the Petersburg Freedmen's Bureau contract that had named her mother, Ruth. Genealogical databases eventually connected the family line to a woman named Yolanda Freeman Brooks, a school administrator living outside Providence, Rhode Island, whose great-great-grandmother, according to family lore passed down mostly through her own grandmother, had worked for rich people up in Maine and never talked about it much. Freeman Brooks had never seen a photograph of any ancestor from that far back. When Kessler emailed her a scan of the cabinet card, along with the multispectral overlay showing the hand pressed into the shawl, Freeman Brooks did not respond for 3 days. When she finally called, she told Kessler she had sat with the image on her kitchen table each of those evenings, just looking at the shape of that hand before she could bring herself to say anything at all. "Nobody ever showed me anything," she said. "Not one thing. And now I've got her hand. I've got proof she was holding somebody, even if I can't see her face." She asked, eventually, whether the society thought there might be more. Other photographs, other households, other hands hidden in other shawls, waiting for someone to tilt the light the right way. Kessler told her, honestly, that she believed there were. The photograph is now part of a small standing exhibit at the Maine Historical Society, examining hidden mother photography and the erasure of domestic laborers from 19th century family archives, displayed alongside the multispectral scans that first revealed the hand, and alongside a printed transcription of Odessa Freeman's 1893 letter, read aloud on a looping audio recording beside the case. Maine Public Radio produced a short segment on the discovery in the spring of 2024. Ann Kessler and Marchetti co-authored a paper on the imaging methodology for a peer-reviewed photography history journal, hoping other archives might apply the same raking light and multispectral protocols to their own uncatalogued Victorian portraits before more hands like Odessa's disappear for good under the weight of 100 more years of nobody looking twice. What the shawl in that photograph teaches you, in the end, is not really about photographic technique or archival method, though it required both to uncover. It is about how much of the truth in an old photograph is not missing, only folded. Somebody once decided that a woman's love for a child she was not permitted to claim should be smoothed out of the record with a brush and a little retouching varnish. And for over a century, the smoothing worked. But cloth remembers the shape of the hand that gripped it, even after the hand is gone, even after the name is scraped half away, even after the census that could have confirmed it all burns to ash in a government basement. Look closely enough, at the right angle, in the right light, and the people we try hardest to erase have a way of leaving just enough of themselves behind to be found. That is the whole of it, really. Nothing disappears completely. It only waits to be seen again.